Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Great Goddess. Praise be to Goddess. Praise be to Goddess. Well, it's another Wednesday, and today we have for you the topic of the history of freedom. The history of freedom will be a two-part series by yours truly, and it'll be this Wednesday and the following Wednesday. So let's get started. The history of freedom is a very broad topic, and we could go into great detail, but we're not going to go into great detail. We're just going to cover a few of the bases of the history of freedom in our world. And the history of freedom begins in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, we had the beginnings of democracy. And democracy was where everyone voted and everyone got a say in who was elected mayor or grand leader or whatever they had in ancient Greece. And back in ancient Greece, they had city-states. So they had city-states that were ruled by rulers, and they would elect their rulers in not all city-states. Not all city-states had democracy, but definitely ancient Athens had democracy. So Athens was the home of democracy and the beginning of democracy in ancient Athens. And they didn't have democracy like we have today. It was only male, free landowners that were citizens of Athens, citizens of ancient Athens got to vote. So not everybody got to vote. Not everybody got to vote. Only those ancient Athens that were men and landowners and free men and citizens of the city-state of Athens, they could vote. And that was the beginning of democracy in our world. Now, what happened was during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages in our world, we had Catholicism rule. Catholicism ruled everything. It was an ancient feudal system where Catholicism was king. And it was a very dreary, depressing time in our world history. And because Catholicism controlled everything, controlled what people thought, controlled what people wrote, controlled what people believed in, because of that, there was very, very little freedom. Okay, the Catholic Church restricted all freedom for all of its parishioners, were restricted in their freedoms and were just, they had no freedom at all, no freedom of thought. They had to write what the Catholic Church wanted them to write and think what the Catholic Church wanted them to think. And if they didn't, they were burned at the stake. It's true. They burned people at the stake who didn't believe, who were heretics. Heretics of the church were punished with burning at the stake. Now, a new chapter opened up in our world history with the advent of Protestantism. And Protestantism wasn't born easily. It took a long time to challenge the power of the church. And originally, Protestants were burned at the stake by the church as heretics. But eventually, with the advent of Lutheranism and Calvinism, the pendulum of power began to swing toward Protestants having their own realms and their own countries and their own freedom of thought. And this opened up vast, vast opportunities for freedom of thought in our world, because the power of the Catholic Church was their absolute power, their absolute stranglehold on religion and freedom of thought was being challenged by Protestants. We had the opportunity for America and all sorts of different freedoms that were enjoyed by Protestants that Catholics did not enjoy. And Catholics did not benefit from. They were still burning heretics at the stake as late as the 1800s. So you can see that the Catholic Church was barbaric and that the Protestants reviled the Catholics for their barbarism and their restriction of all freedoms. Protestants enjoyed their freedom of thought and their freedom to write whatever they wanted. So this opened up the opportunities for creative work, art, for novellas, novels, for social criticism and political criticism, for philosophers, freedom of philosophers, and eventually the philosophy of freedom itself, freedom being embodied in the law. All of these were opened up by Protestantism, challenging the power of the Catholic Church. But it took a long time. All of these things didn't happen overnight. It took a long time for the freedoms that we enjoy today to be established. Protestantism was only the first step. Protestant churches restricted the freedoms of their parishioners as well. For a long time, there were witch hunts and witch burnings, and there was restriction of the freedoms that we enjoy today. But then came the American Revolution. And with the American Revolution came a whole bunch of philosophers and a bunch like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and freedom of thought, freedom to write what you wanted to write. The founding fathers, John Adams, wrote about our country and what it was to have a democratic republic, and these were modeled on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And the voting system that they had. Now, back in those days, it was still only male landowners who were citizens that were allowed to vote. So that had to change. That had to gradually change for freedom for everyone. But it took a long time because there was slavery in this country. And slavery restricted the freedoms of African Americans to vote. Couldn't vote, they had no rights as people. They were property. So it took a long time. But eventually the slaves were liberated and women got the vote. Those were two things that went together in our history of our country, because we had suffragettes or suffragists along with abolitionists that wanted to abolish slavery. The two of them went together, and the two of them were dual goals. Now, abolition was successful first. Abolition came first. And then the freedom of women to vote came second. That came second, freedom of women to vote. So in our country's history, we have first a democratic republic established, and England's stranglehold on our country challenged. Freedom of religion was established through the First Amendment of the Constitution, and all the other freedoms that we enjoy were established today through the Bill of Rights. Then came abolition of slavery, and finally came the right of women to vote. And this is on a timeline stretching over 100 years in our nation's history. All of these things happening all at once, gradually, one at a time, these things happened. So in a very short time in our nation's history, just 100 years, we had freedom of religion, freedom from slavery, freedom of women, and the right to vote. And so all of these things were important milestones in our country's history. And because of these things, we enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy today. And next time, I will be talking about the freedoms that we enjoy today and how they relate to world history, and how and when these freedoms that we enjoy today came about. Until next time, I'm Sarah Jane Althawolf, signing off. Have a great week.